In 2021, we're in our podcast series on true crime in New Brunswick. We're looking back at various major cases that are known in the public domain but continue to be studied because of legalities, because of social impact, because of emotional impact. Now, this situation that occurred in St. John, more than 150 years ago, was the subject of an acclaimed book by author Deborah Comar called Black River Road: An Unthinkable Crime and Unlikely Suspect, and the question of character. Now, Goose Lane put it out. It came out in 2016, but information on the case that's provided in the book was also kind of partially presented in a very important website that's coordinated by the University of New Brunswick and St. John. It's their Crime and Punishment website. Now, this case at Black River can best be described as one of the most newsworthy and the most followed criminal cases in St. John of the 1800s. Now, it concerns the death of Maggie Vale and her child, born out of wedlock. Now, in the 19th century, according to the UNB information I'm going to be narrating from, divorce was rare, if not impossible, for most Canadians, and women were judged by a strict moral code. Men, on the other hand, were given some leeway to sow their all oats, which basically means a man could run around and a woman couldn't. Now, in 1869, St. John, the city was rocked by a scandal that included, of all things, adultery, an illegitimate child, and a suspected double murder. The alleged killer was a middle-aged professional, a respectable married architect with a wife and children. The trial scandalized and fascinated the people of the port city, who heard and read about legal testimony dealing with seduction, adultery, male responsibility for a child, and brutal violence that reached into the city's respectable classes. Now, in the fall of 1869, a number of African-Canadian residents of Simons Parish, beautiful region of St. John, which is east of the city, made a grisly discovery when picking berries in a Loch Lomond area. Among some brushes on the Blueberry Plains near Black River Road, they came across what appeared to be human remains. Now, further examination revealed the partial skeletal remains of a woman and child, and the county coroner, Dr. Sylvester Earle, was notified. Now, the skull of the child revealed marks of foul play. The coroner convened an inquest, which involved several witnesses giving evidence before a jury of 6 men. Key to the later trial was testimony that suggested that in 1868, a mysterious young woman had attempted to pass herself off as a Mrs. Kane, and her child as a child of Mr. Kane. Now, following the arrest of James Kane, the coroner ordered the apprehension of one John A. Monroe, a St. John architect. Testimony from a coachman established that Monroe had arranged for the conveyance of a Mrs. Clark and young child to the Black River Road again in 1868. Now, around the same time, Monroe arranged to send Clark's trunk on a steamer to Boston. When the coachman returned to pick up Monroe in the countryside, he was alone. The woman and child, he had been informed, were staying with friends. A woman who kept a hotel in the city where Mrs. Clark stayed temporarily before disappearing testified that she had suspected that Monroe, a married man, was the father of her child, LMA. The inquest also heard from Jacob Vale, a house carpenter who lived in Carleton, a St. John suburb. He testified that in 1867 he had heard rumors that his niece, Sarah Margaret Vale, was keeping company with Monroe, a married man. Vale's sister confirmed that she gave birth to a child out of wedlock on February 4th, 1968, and that Monroe was the father. Now, Monroe had also spoken of poisoning his wife after the birth of his child. One issue that arose during the trial as a possible motive is that Maggie Vale possessed several $100 in cash after selling a house and land that she inherited from her father. Now, Monroe did not testify before the inquest, but his statements to police were recorded. The architect claimed that he knew Miss Vale from Carleton and that she had been on the same steamer which she had taken to Boston. He told police that at Boston, Vale planned to meet a man who had promised to marry her. Vale had eventually returned to New Brunswick and had persuaded Monroe to escort her and her child to Loch Lomond, where she was supposedly visiting friends. Now, the two bodies had been covered by branches and moss, which indicated, from first evidence, foul play. Other than circumstantial evidence, there was little to pinpoint Monroe as the murderer. Even he did have a motive to avoid scandal of blackmail or having to support a mistress and her child, and of course opportunity. No murder weapon or bullet was ever found. Vale's remains were identified by detailing testimony concerning her teeth, hairstyle, and clothing. Now, at the time in the 1800s, dental records were significantly important because in relation to, let's say, health or structure, dental work was very, very rudimentary, but it would show the upper class and the lower class. And photos of individuals were starting to be taken or published, and artwork as well was an indication of a person's visage, so this could be used in forensics. Now, Dr. Earle eventually enlisted the expertise of two colleagues, one Dr. James Christie and one Dr. LeBaron Botsford, to examine the forensic evidence, notably the skull whose condition suggested that the victim had been shot in the head. Now, one doctor visited a crime scene where he collected brain matter, as well as bones and bone fragments, and a tooth of a child aged 12 to 14 months. Now, Christie performed experiments on another skull, which he covered with muscular tissue and filled with water. He then shot 3 bullets in the skull at a range of 2 feet and concluded that the victim had died in this manner. The coroner had also engaged a land surveyor to prepare a detailed plan of the crime scene, which reared near the junction of Black River Road and Quaco Road. The prosecution brought in 3 dentists who attempted to establish the age of the 2 victims based on their teeth. Now, the defense counsel produced a prominent St. John doctor who testified that it was impossible to identify the adult skeletal remains, which had been damaged by animals, as either male or female. Now, both the Crown and the defense conducted various tests with firearms at the crime scene. The defense contested that pistol shots fired at the site would have been easily heard by nearby settlers. Other technical evidence submitted to the court by the prosecution, including mineralogical records to prove the condition of the ground in October 68, and title charts to establish the position of a steamship in St. John Harbor. Now, after the coroner's jury registered verdicts of willful murder against Johnny Monroe for the murder of Sarah Margaret Vale and Ellie Mae Monroe, the coroner issued a warrant to commit Monroe to the county jail. Now, given his social position, professional connections, and standing in the city, people were shocked that he was placed in handcuffs. He then admitted to knowing Vale and having attempted to assist her, but denied that he was the father of her child. The next stage was the examination before police magistrate Humphrey T. Gilbert, where the testimony before the coroner's inquest was essentially repeated with additional evidence from the coroner. Now, Dr. Earle then revealed that the accused had voluntarily informed him during the course of the inquest that he agreed to take mother and child out to the Black River Road to meet a person Vale expected to marry. He had let them proceed on foot so that he would not be seen by the unnamed party, and returned to the waiting coachman at a nearby inn. It appeared that Monroe was the last person to be seen with Maggie Vale prior to her disappearance. Now, the St. John Circuit Court, under Judge Allen, began hearing the case on December 7, 1969. The trial drew large crowds of spectators. The prosecution was handled by Attorney General of New Brunswick A.R. Wetmore, assisted by W.H. Tuck, and Monroe was defended by prominent barrister S.R. Thompson. Now, one issue discussed early in the proceedings was whether newspaper coverage had prejudiced the case for the defense. This has been going on in media coverage for a lot of years. It happened to me with some court cases I covered in the mid-1980s, but nothing came of it because the guy confessed in one case. Now, the defense at the time was permitted to challenge a dozen potential jurors, but the defendant had no right to testify. On the other hand, unlike in capital trials earlier in the 19th century, the defense lawyer was at least permitted to address the jury. Now, press accounts of the trial noted the testimony of the colored witnesses of the Willow Grove area, a community formed by American refugees from the War of 1812. A store clerk testified that the defendant had purchased a Smith & Wesson 7-barrel 22 caliber revolver in the fall of '68. The Crown also produced most of the residents of the area to which Vale, according to Monroe's statement, had been heading, either to visit friends or to meet a man she intended to wed. None of the residents of that section of Black River Road had known a Maggie Vale or a Mrs. Clark, which was Vale's assumed name at the time. Now, testimony by a coachman and others placed Monroe, Vale, and her daughter at Willow Grove on the afternoon of Halloween, October 31st, '68. The truck sent to Boston to follow 68 was never claimed. It was returned to New Brunswick a year later at the request of the authorities, and its contents became evidence in a trial. Now, the defense counsel attempted to have Monroe's statement to police chief of Portland, a suburb of St. John, excluded. The police officer testified that Monroe had been warned by the police magistrate not to make any statement without first talking to a lawyer, but that the prisoner had conversed freely, despite also being cautioned by the police chief of St. John. Now, Thompson criticized the role of police chief. A personal acquaintance of the accused had promised to keep his conversation confidential. Now, the defense eventually elicited a host of character witnesses, including the sheriff and deputy sheriff of the county, and asked the jury to consider why his client, a married man with a prosperous professional practice, would risk everything by committing such a crime, especially when his relationship with Vale was so widely known. Now, Thompson attempted to prove that the truck purporting to be Vale's had been made in the States, not New Brunswick, and that there was no proof that the bodies discovered at Willow Grove were Vale and her child. A last-minute defense witness, a farmer from Sussex, claimed to have given a lift in the wagon to a young woman and child from Willow Grove to St. John, where he boarded the steamer to Boston. Now, given the compelling weight of the circumstantial evidence against Monroe, the defense appealed to the jury's emotions and attacked the police, the coroner, the police magistrate, and the criminal law itself for undermining British justice. Now, in his charge to the jury, Judge Allen explained that many cases in English and Canadian law had turned on circumstantial evidence. The judge summed up the evidence on three key questions. Were the remains those of Vale? Had she been murdered? And had she been murdered by the accused? The juror came back with a guilty verdict, which in 1869 was an automatic death sentence, but with a strong recommendation of mercy. Supporters of Monroe circulated a petition urging the government to exercise clemency. Now, on the day the judge was scheduled to pronounce sentence, disorder prevailed as upwards of 1,500 people, including noisy boys, crowded in the courtroom, the hall and the stairway, and the street outside. Judge Allen noted that the jury's recommendation for mercy was probably motivated by concern for the prisoner's family. He would forward the request to Ottawa, but entertained no hope of a favorable outcome. Now, according to Allen, you should use all the time you have to spare in this world in seeking forgiveness from Almighty God for your many sins, as you cannot hope for mercy from man. I shall not refer to anything that might wound your feelings, but all I shall say is that the unfortunate woman who placed reliance in you was hurried before her Maker without that preparation which, so far as we can judge, she surely needed. You shall have further time to prepare for debt and for obtaining that forgiveness you so much need. Now, a lot of people believe that he committed a murder, a lot of people did not, but according to published reports, on the eve of his death, Monroe confessed. Now, the confession, dated February 14, 1870, was witnessed by Reverend Charles Stewart and Reverend James Lathern. Interestingly, the prisoner expressed no remorse and asked for no forgiveness. According to his confession, the first time I went out with Miss Vale was only for a ride. We had no quarrel, and our going out was at her wish. When we got out of the coach, at or near the place described on the trial, she had a satchel, and we walked along the road. I cannot say how far. We sat down and had a little talk and practice, both fired at a mark, she using a pistol I gave her one a pair, a breech loader, same as my own. The mate of it I gave to a friend. I had learned her how to use it. There was no intention on my part to harm her at that time. We came back, and I left her at Lakes. She was to have gone to Boston on Thursday after the first going out, but it was too stormy, and I went with my wife to Frankton on that day, and came down again on Friday night. It was during that trip to Frankton I first thought that the spot I had visited with Miss Vale was a suitable spot to commit the bad act. I went out again with Miss Vale on the Saturday following. We went the same road as before, and to about the same place. The morning was frosty, the moss was crisp and hard. There was no one on the barren. The road was a little muddy. We went off the road a little way together and sat down. I went to the bushes. The child cried. I came out again, was angry. I strangled the child. I do not know if it was actually dead. As she was rising up, I shot her in the head. I cannot say that that money was not one of the motives for the act committed. I do not say it was in self-defense. I killed Miss Vale. It was the money. My anger with her at the time and my bad thoughts on and after the trip to Frankton, working together, caused me to do the bad act. The letter written to Mrs. Creer was written by me and mailed by a friend of mine living in or near Boston. I never kill any other person or child. Now, the execution on February 15, 1870, ironically after Valentine's Day. The prisoner, according to an account published by George Day, was visited by clergymen the evening before execution, and he was calm and resigned to his fate. He went to sleep at midnight and rose at 4 a.m., dressed and prayed. As the dawn broke and the morning came, he was joined by the clergymen, magistrates, the coroner's jury, and other officials, as well as local newspaper reporters. Now at 7:45 a.m., a bell began to toll, and the black flag of death was raised over the jail. The prisoner, appearing pale and anxious, was escorted to the gallows by the sheriff and the two ministers. Now, prior to Monroe leaving the death cell, the noose had been placed around his neck, while a clergyman advised him not to think of earthly things, but to fix his mind on the Savior of mankind. Now, unlike earlier hangings, this one took place on a public site in a jail yard. The gallows device was a new mechanism consisting of a beam, one end of which was attached to the noose. The other end was attached to a heavy weight suspended by a rope. When the rope was cut, the beam rose in the air, lifting the condemned man. One account recorded when the fatal cord was cut, and the miserable man jerked from terra firma and was suspended in the air 2 feet from the platform. He struggled hard, and his sufferings appeared to be terrible. Now, unlike the case of Breen, who was hanged in 1857 and buried on the grounds of the almshouse, and other execution prisoners elsewhere in Canada who were buried within the walls of a local jail, in this case Monroe's corpse was released to his family for Christian burial. Now, one footnote in the case concerns Monroe's wife, Annie Potts, who had married in 1862. In 1878, she remarried Edwin Snyder. The last execution in St. John took place in November of 56, when Clifford Ailes, a Northern New Brunswick resident who was 26, was hung for the murder of a robbery victim in 1955. The last person to be hung in the province was my cousin, Joe Richard, who was executed in Dalhousie in 57 for sexually assaulting and strangling a 13-year-old girl. Now, in this case, he was tried twice. It was deemed a mistrial. On the second trial, he was eventually executed in the fall. He committed the offense in the winter of 56-57 and executed in the fall winter of 57-58. So between, like in this case, less than 18 months, but in Joe Richard case, 12 months. Now, in the same case of Joe Richard, this was an individual that was known to the public. In the case of the Monroe, he was known to be what they call a person of renown, of money. Joe Richard was known to be a bad pup. If a murder case involves people that are known to the public, it's easier to gain information because people will send a criminal to the gallows or will tell about their machinations much more quickly if they're known to the public. It's hard to prove a murderer if nobody knows him. It takes more forensic evidence, which we have in 2021, but back then, if the person was known to police or the public, there was usually somebody who was going to speak. Now, full reports of the coroner's inquest and trial of Johnny Monroe for the murder of Sarah Margaret Vale and Ellie Mae Monroe are available in something called the Black River Road Tragedy by G.W. Day from 1870, and is also available on microfiche as CIHM number 1172 of the St. John Morning News, September 1869 to March 1870. So, actually, I think in the Irving Ike archives, they could be there. I'm not really sure, because I was a former staff reporter for Brunswick News, and I know there's archives of a lot of the St. John papers, so if you can find it. But the St. John Library would. It's interesting reading, but like I said, that book that was written 5 years ago, and the original Black River Tragedy details, it's quite interesting. But as a lot of people know, the Vale last name is a very, very common name amongst southern New Brunswick residents. So I had went to school with a couple of the Vale family, and even they were, apprehensive of talking about what the incidents meant to their families, because at the time, like I said, St. John was a place of commerce, connections with New England. There was a lot of good money in there, but he had poverty as well. Like I talk about the black, what do you call it, not sharecroppers, but farm workers and stuff like that. St. John in 2021, there's so much history. It's been built up over the years, but if you want to find any information about what do you call the Loyalists, 1812, the criminal aspect, the commercial aspect, sports and all that, from 1784, the creation of New Brunswick, up until 1984, it's quite a story. So if you want to study anything, do your treatise, the varied history of St. John. My brother works down there now, and I visited St. John for the first time 41 years ago. I love the city. I travel there quite often. It's probably one of my favorite communities in North America, because anything that the world has to offer, you can find in St. John. It's got everything. Anyway, and as well, some of the most interesting murder stories of all time. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what we're doing, we're a true crime podcast. Let us know. Give us a like, comment, subscribe, and we wish you a good weekend. Bye.